Hello, welcome back to my channel, and today I'm counting down my top 10 films of Sam Peckinpah, or Sam Peckinpah if you prefer, or as the critic David Thompson, this English critic who went to live in America, and he sort of tried to put on a bit of an American accent, and he calls him Sam Peckinpah. Why? I don't know, it sounds absolutely ridiculous. Sam Peckinpah. Anyway, Sam Peckinpah, who was a major Western filmmaker through the 60s and 70s, a very controversial figure. He was called Bloody Sam because of the violence of his movies. Monty Python even made a sketch about him. But I didn't really know very much about Sam Peckinpah. To tell you the truth, before the 90s, before I came to London and I discovered repertory cinema and classic cinema at the National Film Theatre in London, I'd never heard of him. I'd never heard of these major films like The Wild Bunch and Straw Dogs. But when I discovered the National Film Theatre and when I really got into movies proper, he was the first director I discovered. And Straw Dogs was the first film I ever saw at the National Film Theatre in London. That was the start of my cinephile journey with Sam Peckinpah. They were doing a season of his films at the time. And two things really struck me about Peckinpah. The first is, I'd never seen an American filmmaker whose films felt so raw and lived in. You know, together with the cinematographer Lucien Ballad, you know, he created these Western worlds where you could almost smell the sweat on people's clothes. You could smell the tequila on their breath. You could see the dust in the air. There was a rawness, a vitality, a lived-inness about his films. Sometimes when you're watching a classic Western, they're wonderful films, but they're a bit clean. You know, they seem a bit artificial. Peckinpah brings in the dirt and the crap and the horse shit of the real West kind of into the film. He sort of suffuses the texture of the film. But at the same time, they are incredibly tightly controlled. Peckinpah is one of the great editors, one of the great editor-directors. There was one person who said about The Wild Bunch, it was the best editing they'd ever seen since Eisenstein with Battleship Potemkin. And I think they were onto something, actually. His editing is extraordinary, the way he, you know, these incredible shoot-'em-up sequences where he, you know, has a really fast action, then he'll slow down, then he's cutting in little scenes and everything's sort of simultaneous. They're sort of beautiful, they're almost rhythmic, like a piece of music. If you watch the starting shoot-'em-up bit in The Wild Bunch, the way that the editing of the sequence picks up on the song that the abstentionists are singing as they walk down the street, you know, We'll Go Down by the River, that song. There's some, you know, the control that Peckinpah has, the craftsmanship, together with this rough texture, is something that I'd not seen in American film before and which I really responded to. So you've got the best of both worlds. You've got the highly crafted, you know, mainstream cinema, but you've also got the rough reality of sort of independent art house cinema. On top of this, what I really responded to as a 20-something male to Peckinpah's cinema was Peckinpah's films, more than about being about the West and America, what they're really about is men. The nature of men, the way they bond together, male friendship, a subject that is now absent in most mainstream cinema, it's barely discussed. And it gave Peckinpah a reputation for being a bit macho, a bit machismo. You know, back in the day, Peckinpah was always a controversial filmmaker. He was known for his violence. Now he's an even more controversial filmmaker because he's known for his machismo and his sexism and misogyny and occasional homophobia. And the problem here is that the reason Peckinpah is disliked is because he is not a filmmaker of the intellect. He is not a filmmaker who appeals to the mind or to the spirit. He doesn't appeal to the heart, right? He doesn't even appeal to the blood, the senses, you know, like sort of great action filmmakers, or filmmakers, for example, like Almodovar with all their sensual colour and, you know, elaborate music. No, he's not a filmmaker of any of those parts of the body or the senses. He's a filmmaker of here, the gut. the cock. Your intestines, your bowels. What Peckinpah is interested in doing is scraping out all the innards and having a good look at what's inside. You see, Peckinpah was the last of the great Western men. He'd grown up in the West. You know, his father had some kind of ranch out there. But he'd grown up in the West, and he knew the West, and he knew the men who worked the West. And those are the men who appear in his films. And Peckinpah was an educated and intelligent man who had this, you know, this kind of dream, this nostalgia of the West, coming into a more liberal counterculture era. And so his films are setting these old men of the West against this new vision of American history. And so Peckinpah is rather aggressively counterpointing these Old West and these men against the growing trends in the liberal West. And that's given him a reputation as being a bit of a macho director, a man's director. And certainly I don't think there's much appeal for these films for women or gay men. You know, they are straight men's movies, I think, in a way, perhaps unfortunately. But the thing is, what we should also keep an eye on here is that because Peckinpah is interested in the gut, two things. First of all, what Peckinpah wants to say is a cautionary note. Here you are in this new liberal age, which flatters your ego, it flatters your intellectual capabilities and your moral capabilities. But don't forget you're still a man. You're still driven by your gut. You're still driven by things like sexual jealousy, rivalry, you know, friendship. These things that are deep in the blood are still there, and that's what I want to look at. And the second thing to remember about Peckinpah is he doesn't just celebrate men rather odiously, you know, like bromance or buddy movies. Look how self-destructive his men are. In the way that they try to hold on to the past, they only destroy themselves. These are brutal films, tragic films, but they're not tragic in the Shakespearean sense that appeals to our mind and our sense of, you know, the universe. They're tragic in a very sort of intimate level. This is very sort of intimate, raw poetry. So let's get into the top 10. Now at number 10, I'm going to pick The Getaway, which I believe was the most commercially successful Peckinpah film on first release. It's a famous crime thriller, very tautly directed by Peckinpah, starring Steve McQueen and Ali MacGraw. And I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. I recognise that it's a very well-made film, but I have all sorts of issues with it, mostly because it's really nasty. And Peckinpah could be nasty. That was the worst side of him. I mean, I particularly dislike the scene in this film where the villain holds up with this vet and his wife in this outbuilding out in the middle of nowhere, and he just takes the wife, and the wife is seen as this rather silly, you know, easygoing woman, and they really sort of torture the poor husband. It's a nasty piece of work. I don't like this film. I don't think Steve McQueen is a Peckinpah actor. He doesn't bring the complexity of character that someone like Warren Oates or James Coburn brings. The film works, it's very effective, but effectiveness doesn't really interest me. What interests me is the spirit and texture of a film. And I don't much care for this movie. It's very well made, but it's cruel. In ninth place is Major Dundee. Now, Major Dundee is the first film in what would become the Peckinpah myth. You know, the great director versus the studios who don't understand this genius. They took the movie away from me, man. They cut it and edited it without me, man. You know, this is the first time it happens. This is the first great ruined masterpiece of many in Peckinpah's career. And of course, those Peckinpah fans, like myself, buy into this myth, you know, that Sam was this really independent-minded, brilliant genius against the suits. A little note of caution here. From interviews with people who collaborated with Peckinpah, it's clear that Peckinpah, a bit like Wells, constantly tinkered with his films. He was never quite happy, right? And it seems to me with Major Dundee, he would never have finished this film. I don't think he really knew how to finish it, actually. When you watch it, it's a kind of blasted masterpiece, a broken masterpiece. The scenes, the action scenes in it are extraordinary. And you can see that this is made by a great filmmaker. But it's not quite getting there. Again, the lead actor is Charlton Heston, who I don't think has the complexity as an actor to match Coburn and Warren Oates. The kind of complexity of actor that Peckinpah really needs. And I just feel that Peckinpah lost his way with the editing. I don't think it was a case of the suits taking it away from him. I think it was that he was never going to finish it. What you've got is, the beginnings of what will become the Wild Bunch and the mastery of Peckinpah in his mature period. But in this first film, it's not quite there yet. But if you've never seen it, it's well worth checking out. Now, in 8th place is The Ballad of Cable Hogue. Now, we need to talk about this film for a little bit. If you ever watch any documentaries about Peckinpah, or you read any books about him and you get witness statements from critics or academics or fellow directors, a lot of them will say, of course, most people know about the Wild Bunch and Pat Garrett and so on, but of course the true connoisseurs know that the real Peckinpah great film is, of course, The Ballad of Cable Hogue. Now, why do they say that? They say that because Peckinpah is infamous for his violence, for his savagery, and occasionally his nastiness towards women, right? Ballad of Cable Hogue is a more reflective, calmer, less violent film. It's more refined. It sort of flatters the intellectual or aesthete's ego more, right? Takes us away from the gut, as I was saying, more towards the heart and the mind. Therefore, they see it as a better film. I think they're wrong. And ironically, I think they're wrong because, although I love Peckinpah, and I'm going to argue in this video that he's a great director, he's narrow. He is a narrow-minded person. He's not a very profound director. What you get in art sometimes, you get certain artists who they plough the same furrow over and over again, but they can do it brilliantly, better than some more intelligent or profound artists can do. But when they try to extend outwards from that furrow, they show their limitations. Peckinpah is like that. Peckinpah's, his métier, his register, the place where he exists, is amongst the bastards, the crooks, the swindlers, the rogues. And that's where Peckinpah, his understanding of humanity comes up from below. There's a brilliant, when I was at university, I read a Mexican novel set in the Mexican Revolution. It's called Los de Abajo. And it's about the foot soldiers of that revolution, the guys at the bottom, not the generals, not the officers, not the people who can talk about strategy or principle, but the guys at the bottom who are just killing and drinking and eating and whoring. And it's a brilliant book. Peckinpah is an artist of Los de Abajo, those below, those underneath. And that's when he's in that world, then he produces a ferocious, beautiful poetry. But when he kind of comes out of that world, he's exposed, because actually his philosophy of life is not that complex, right? It's like Sergio Leone was a brilliant Western maker, but if he tried to make a complex political thriller, it'd have shown him up. Hitchcock existed within that world of the thriller and made some of the best films ever made. But if Hitchcock had tried to make, I don't know, something, a complex art film, I think he'd have been shown up. The Ballad of Cable Hogue, by trying to be more refined, trying to be a more complex discussion of the creation of the West, it shows up his fallibilities. And part of the reason for that is because in the films where Peckinpah is looking at rogues, the film is held in the balance, right? We're not asked to sympathise with the rogues or be like them, but we are asked to live with them. That's the genius of the Wild Bunch, right? But in this film, we're asked to sympathise with the Jason Robards character. We're asked to sympathise with the David Warner character. And I don't see why we should, because they're not particularly likeable. The way Jason Robards treats his girlfriend is horrible. David Warner is just a sex pest. I don't find that funny or amusing, and I don't find it particularly profound. It's a very well-made film. It's obviously a film made by a master, but it actually is rather unlikable, more unlikable to me than something down in the dirt and the shit like Straw Dogs or The Wild Bunch, because that's got something profound to say to us who think we're up above it, up above the swamp, right? But when Peckinpah tries to come up to that level, he just seems narrow-minded. And that's why I think the Ballad of Cable Hogue is not quite as good as people think it is. Now, some Peckinpah fans might be thinking at this point, hey, this guy doesn't like Peckinpah. Well, I do. So let's quickly get on to the 7 films of Peckinpah's that I absolutely adore. Now, at number 7 is Junior Bonner. This is the other Steve McQueen film that regularly gets ignored. Now, this is Peckinpah on holiday. Like Ballad of Cable Hogue, this film also moves away from the violence and the nastiness. And it's a more sentimental film. It's a modern Western. It's a rodeo movie. And Steve McQueen, who's much better in this film than he is in The Getaway, in my opinion, plays this old rodeo hand trying to go back on the circuit. And his father is played by Robert Preston. His wife is played by Ida Lupino, which is a rare sympathetic role for a woman in a Peckinpah movie. And this is a more genial, laid-back, relaxed film, and is all the better for it. The rodeo movie is a little subgenre of American cinema that I quite like. There's a brilliant recent example, Chloe Chow's The Rider. If you've never seen that, it's well worth checking out. And this is an excellent addition. It's a very sympathetic portrait of this world that Peckinpah clearly likes, and a sympathetic portrait of how it's kind of threatened by modern development. Steve McQueen's brother in the film just wants to sort of revamp it and modernise it. If you've never seen it, it's a very seldom talked about movie, but it's actually really, really enjoyable. It's really, life-affirming, as so many Peckinpah films are not. In 6th place, we get Ride the High Country. Now, don't all jump at me at once. I know that many Peckinpah fans will be surprised that I'm not rating this film higher, and I probably should be. If nothing else, this is probably the most important film in Peckinpah's oeuvre, because this was the film that changed the Western. There's no question about that. It is one of the most important films in the Western genre. When I was growing up, right, there's 2 sort of eras of the Western. There's the classic Western, John Ford, Howard Hawks, Anthony Mann, Raoul Walsh. And then you get what's called the revisionist Western, the Western of the 60s and 70s that makes the Western more realistic and darker and more ambiguous. And that Western is most associated with Peckinpah and Sergio Leone. And when I was growing up, my dad was into classic Westerns, but I found them a bit boring, right? And I like the revisionist Westerns. I like Leone and Ulzana's Raid and McCabe and Mrs. Miller and these kind of movies. And so when I watched Ride the High Country in my 20s, I absolutely loved it. This brilliant thing where they take 2 old Western stars, Joel McCrea and Randolph Scott, and they put them in this kind of new Western narrative. And what you see is that these 2 old, tall in the saddle, giants of the Western come into contact with this new West, the West of gold miners, tough guys, the guys who John Ford called Liberty Valance, right? Real roughnecks. One of the things I admire about Peckinpah, Ford made this film called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a very important Western, which was trying to look at the reality of the creation of the West, right? So that the people who made the West were not civilized, like the James Stewart character in the film. They were tough cowboys, like the John Wayne character, who had to kill and overwhelm really tough guys, like the Lee Marvin character, in order to make the West, in order to make civilization, right? But Ford, I think, was a bit sentimental. He believed in the myth of the West, and he wanted to keep it going. Even though he wanted to question it, he wanted to keep it going. So Liberty Valance, in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, is not very tough. This is where Peckinpah comes in. Peckinpah brings the real Liberty Valances, the real men who made the West, into Western cinema. And Warren Oates and his brother buddies in the film, and the drunken judge who presides in the mining town, it's like, for the first time in the Western, you can feel the chill winds of winter in the air. You've had your high summer, of John Wayne and James Stewart and Randolph Scott, but now winters are coming. And suddenly like a sort of tsunami of cold water, or winds coming in, the November winds, and the evenings are getting darker. You feel the chill of the new Western, the new way of thinking about the West. And it comes in this film, in Ride the High Country. Those scenes with the miners in that film are really quite dark. They're quite frightening. And you know what? I loved this film when I was in my 20s, but it was because I loved the revisionist Western. But now in my old age, I've rediscovered the classic Western. I rather like it. I rather like Randolph Scott and James Stewart, you know. And so when I watch this film now, I don't like it as much as I did when I was in my 20s, because I can see that lovely classic Western is being eaten away. Something new and darker is coming in. But you cannot fault Peckinpah for the brilliance of the filmmaking. And the film still has a massive charge. I mean, that ending, you know, when Joel McCrea wants to enter his house justified and he dies looking back at the mountain. One of the great endings in Western cinema. At number 5, Straw Dogs. Yes, that most reviled of all Peckinpah films I've put at number 5. Yes, that one that I don't think will be viewed anytime soon in university lecture halls because of that infamous sequence where Susan George gets raped twice and appears to a it. This is a verboten film. Of course, when I first saw it, it had been a sort of verboten film in Britain for many years. It was never shown on television. It was banned from television. And in the 90s, censorship was relaxed, and all these movies like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and, you know, Clockwork Orange and everything started to be viewed. It was a fascinating time. I've spoken about Straw Dogs at length on this channel before, and I'll give you a link to where I talk about it. The thing is, this is the ultimate gut film of Peckinpah. This is the ultimate film looking at the modern man and the pretensions of the modern man, the modern intellectual. Dustin Hoffman plays this mathematician who moves back to his young wife's home in Cornwall, and the local Cornish people are very hostile towards him and try to take his home and his wife away from him. So it's a very earthy, primitive film. It's about how this intellectual has to face up to violence and aggression, and in so doing becomes even more violent, even more nastier than them in order to fight them off. So it's a film where Peckinpah says to the modern human man, you think you're so clever, you think you're so above this, but this is still there in your blood. And that's why a lot of intellectuals hate this movie with a vengeance. It is extraordinarily repellent, but I don't think you can watch it and say that it is not a great piece of filmmaking. The last 30 minutes, the siege of Trenchard's farm, I think is one of the most brilliant, sustained pieces of tense filmmaking, action filmmaking in cinema history. It's extraordinary. It really gets to you. And the fact that it teeters on the verge of being ridiculous actually makes it more pungent, more powerful. I said in a previous video, Straw Dogs is like watching a film. And it's been made by your neighbour 3 doors down, who's got a Union Jack outside. And he watches GB News, you know, the right-wing news channel. And he's got really biased views. And he's a real thug. And he makes a film, and he makes a film that's better than you can make. And is actually brilliantly made. And watching Straw Dogs, it feels like that. If you think that Straw Dogs is just a grunt film, check out the opening shot, which always catches my breath. A young boy sitting on a grave, looking back at the spire of a church with rebellion in his eyes. Simple image, but so powerful, and what the film is really about. That youthful, independent spirit that society tries to control, looking back at that figure of authority, the steeple. You know, how much is our social control and all those things like religion and morals, how much is that really controlling the turbulence of what's going on in our gut, in our blood? 4th place is Cross of Iron. Now, this is a movie that I've come to love more and more as I've got older. Now, God knows, I don't like war movies. I don't like combat movies. All those bloody awful British World War II movies, you know. Bogey at 4 o'clock, bogey at 4 o'clock, let's get Jerry. No, thank you. right? That's not my kind of cinema. So I usually avoid war films like The Plague. I mean, the other day, Saving Private Ryan came up on the TV. I made it through about 2 minutes. I can't be bothered. Cross of Iron is a rare exception. Why do I like Cross of Iron? First of all, because I think Peckinpah, more than any other filmmaker, gets to the truth of men in wartime. The men in the film feel like they've been living in war. They look dirty. You can almost smell them. And the way that they sort of interact with each other, the way that they bond together, the sort of slight level of aggression between them is so true. You can believe in these people who've been fighting this endless war for months on end. It's also interesting because it's a film made from the German point of view. These are soldiers who are retreating from Russia right at the end of the Second World War conflict. I also love this movie, though. There are parts of this movie, Peckinpah was on the drink and the drugs at this point, and there are parts of this movie that are a bit naive, and that put me off when I first watched it. So all the stuff with the little Russian boy soldier is crap. It's a bit embarrassing, right? But then the dialogue between Steiner, played by Coburn, and Coburn is quite brilliant in this film, and his officers is fantastic. And just to give you one example, a line that has stuck in my head more than anything. Steiner has an opposition in Maximilian Schell's character. Now, Maximilian Schell's character is an old Prussian. He's an aristocrat. He's not fighting the war for the Nazis. He's fighting it for nobility, for, his sort of aristocratic pride. And he becomes Steiner's, enemy. And that's one of the other things I like about Cross of Iron. One of the things I think that Orson Welles, who called this the best war movie ever made, I think that's what Orson Welles liked about it, is it shows that what war is really about is not race or Nazism, or politics. It's about class. It's about people up here making people down here, again, Los de Abajo, do what they want, right? So that's one of the things I like about it. Anyway, so Steiner and Maximilian Schell are opposed to each other. And Maximilian Schell has committed an infraction, and Steiner knows about it. So Steiner could put him in jail, right? And the officers are with Steiner, they like him. And Coburn says, no, I'm not going to do it. And the officers say, well, why not? We're trying to help you here, we're on your side. And Coburn delivers this incredible line. He says, do you think just because you like me that I'd hate you any less? You're officers, and I hate all officers. That line has stayed with me all my life. And that's the brilliance of this film. For all its sort of occasional infelicities, and, Peckinpah's been on the drugs, and his editing and his sense of narrative sometimes slips a bit. Oh my God, some of the truths this film delivers up about men and their attitude to war and fighting is absolutely incredible. And I find this film more and more, that brilliant sequence where Coburn has been invalided out, and he's got concussion, and he's at this sort of party in the hospital, and he goes up to the plates and the cakes and everything arranged, and you hear the sounds of battle and machine gun fire, and he starts smashing the plates. That is a brilliant sequence, brilliantly edited by Peckinpah. Superb. In third place, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia. Now, this is a movie you need to see as a young man. I saw it when I was about 25 for the first time, and it has scarred me for life. This is the film where I think Peckinpah most gets under the bonnet of the human male and what's really driving him. And he does it under the guise of this rather ridiculous cult movie where Warren Oates, brilliant performance, just so good. He plays this bartender in this Mexican bar, and he finds out that a bounty is being offered for this guy called Alfredo Garcia, who's got the local jefe's daughter pregnant, and he's wanted dead or alive. And this bartender sees it as his chance to better his life, and he finds out that his girlfriend has actually been having a bit of an affair herself with Alfredo Garcia. So there's this whole undercurrent of sexual jealousy that drives the film, and it's very powerful. I think that this is Peckinpah's most personal film. Some people think it was his portrait of him versus his Hollywood producers. Many people dismissed it as shit. Robert Culp, one of Peckinpah's friends, dismissed it as a load of crap, and many people have done it. It was voted actually one of the 50 worst films of all time in a book published in the 80s. I could not disagree more. You see, here, this film poses the question of what is poetry? Is poetry saying the right thing? Is poetry being refined or respectable? Or is it finding a completely idiosyncratic way of expressing pain, emotion, fear, desire? Could a crappy little cult movie, some bounty hunter chasing down a guy with loads of violence, could this be a scream of despair? Which in a sense I think is what all Peckinpah's best films are, really. I think this is the key Peckinpah film in that sense. It's not the sort of grand statement that The Wild Bunch is. It's not the beautiful film that Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is. It's a crappy, shitty, nasty, but filled with strains of beauty. I mean, that incredible scene where, Warren Oates wakes up in the open grave with his dead girlfriend lolling all over him, and he sort of wails and weeps. And then that transmutes into this weird black comedy where he's got the head of Alfredo Garcia buzzing with flies, and he's sort of talking to it like he's in a buddy movie with him. You see, what I'm trying to say is that next, in a month's time, there'll be the Oscars. And Oppenheimer, a very clean, well-made film with followable themes and, easily distinguishable plus points, will win the award. But is that poetry? I mean, what is idiosyncratic about it? What does it really make us feel? Does it challenge us? Does it torture us? Here's a bargain basement film, broken all over the place, with some scenes that are embarrassing, some scenes that might be described as misogynistic or homophobic or even racist. And yet, once you've watched it, it's like a thorn stuck in your flesh. That's film poetry to me. Now, in second place, and I can't quite believe I'm going to put this film in second place, is The Wild Bunch. Now, everyone knows The Wild Bunch. It's a very famous film. It was one of the very first films I saw at the National Film Theatre. And when I first saw it, I was puzzled by it. Here's this Western. It's very well made. It has a brilliant opening shootout sequence, a fantastic end shootout sequence, with a great train robbery sequence in the middle. But the rest of the movie, it seemed to me at my young age, is just a chase. What's all the fuss about? So I watched the film and then I couldn't get it out of my head, right? So I watched it again and suddenly it appeared in front of me. And I watched it many, many times in my 20s. I became rather obsessive about The Wild Bunch, perhaps a bit unhealthily so, actually. And I had this picture on my bedroom wall for quite a while. William Holden with the machine gun, and you can hear Ernest Borgnine off camera kind of go, "Give 'em hell, Pike!" I love that so much. Why do I like this movie so much? What happens here is this. Peckinpah puts us in the company, for the first time, I think, arguably, in any Western, of the people, of the bad guys, the shits, the rogues, the drunkards, the brawlers, the bastards, right? And he doesn't try to make us like them. He doesn't try to make us sympathise with them, but we just with them on their own terms for over 2 hours. That's the key of this extraordinary movie, right? And by putting us on their level, on the level of Los de Abajo, right? He makes a statement about the rest of us, the rest of humanity. And eventually, these people, they reach a dead end. There's a wonderful line where William Holden is having a nighttime chat with Ernest Borgnine. He says, "Look, we'll get out." And Ernest Borgnine snaps back, "Get out to what?" It's the most powerful line in the film. And eventually they reach a dead end. And the only thing that they can do is to go to the aid of their Mexican friend and kill themselves in this incredible riotous end shootout. It's a portrait of men, rogues, who you suspect that Peckinpah quite likes, but you also see that he understands their self-destructiveness. It's a kind of curious thing about Peckinpah, an irony. He loved the Western of John Ford, but in a way he destroyed it. Just like the self-destructive men in his films, Peckinpah takes over the Western, and by showing the horribleness that underneath it, sets about destroying it, which is what happens in The Wild Bunch, even though it's one of the greatest Westerns ever made. We should just talk about the filmmaking a little bit, shouldn't we? Because the editing is extraordinary. I remember when I first saw that end sequence, and I love the way that Peckinpah stages it, right? That wonderful sequence. And he sets it in a very untypical Western scenario. He sets it almost in this kind of Greek theatre. It's like this theatre of war, right? Where the machine gun is set up on the altar overlooking the worshippers who are all going to be slaughtered, right? And that extraordinary shot of, Warren Oates spinning around, wailing, shooting up all the, the beautiful crockery and the stuff on the table. I find that scene incredible. And then, the bit at the end where William Holden gets on and Borgnine shouts, "Give him hell, Pike!" And everything just goes crazy. And then the boy shoots William Holden in the back and Borgnine goes, "Pike! Pike!" And the music goes down. Every single time that sequence gets me. I feel watching that sequence gives me a kind of ecstasy. And then I get a sort of in my chest. I don't know any other film that does it. And yet, these people are horrible people. That's the genius of Peckinpah. Just one more point about Wild Bunch before I go. If you're a young filmmaker out there, you're interested in action sequences, watch the train robbery sequence in this film, then watch it again, and then watch it again. You will never see a better sequence in film in terms of editing, staging, the way he uses different shots and topographies to map out exactly what's happening. When you've got all sorts of different groups, you've got the Wild Bunch, you've got the guys who are following them, led by Robert Ryan, you've got the cavalrymen, all things that are happening at once, and you absolutely follow it. It's brilliantly done. So brilliant that Peckinpah kind of shows off through his main character. William Holden holds up his hand like that. Wonderful sequence, one bit of bravado as the bridge blows up and the horses fall into the river. It's an absolutely incredible sequence. The best bit, of course, though, and what Peckinpah was famous for throughout his lifetime, was the slow-mo. I love that bit where Warren Oates fires this gun, kills this bloke, and the bloke falls from the train. Then you go back to a bit of business, he's still falling. Then you go back to another bit of business, and he's still falling. It's just, that's cinema sex to me. But amazingly, I haven't put The Wild Bunch at number one. Perhaps 10 years ago, I definitely would have done. But as I've got older, there's another film that's crept up on me. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Now here is another film. This is the most cracked and beaten up and ruined film of Peckinpah's by the studio. The original release cut isn't worth a dime. There's many versions of this film, and none of them are really definitive. There was a sort of director's cut produced in the late 80s. And then some critics and film historians got together and did another edit, which has now become the sort of definitive edit of the film, which makes more of the brilliant and very underrated Bob Dylan soundtrack. But there's no real definitive version of the movie. Again, watching this movie, you might think, what's so special about this movie, right? You know the story of Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid were outlaws together in their youth, and then Pat Garrett changed sides. He went over to the law, and because Billy the Kid was still an outlaw, he had to go after his old friend and kill him. That's one of the fables of the American West. And what happens is Coburn, and I think this is James Coburn's finest screen performance ever. He brings out every nuance of Garrett's character and his tragedy. what happens is he goes round the place, rounding up people who knew him and Billy the Kid to try and get them to kill Billy the Kid, and they get killed, and eventually Pat Garrett kills Billy the Kid. And that's it. It seems at first watch just to be a series of violent encounters, and you think, well, what's so great about this movie? Well, what is great about this film reveals itself as you get older. Because what this film is about is how getting old means that you inevitably kill the person you were in your youth, and how you have to do it. And that is what is so powerful and moving about this film. That's the underlying idea of it. And so what is happening is that Garrett, in order to secure his new status, has to kill, Billy the Kid, who, played by Chris Christopherson, is sort of, idealised. And the series of sequences by which Peckinpah does this are so beautiful that it's come to raise it above Wild Bunch of My Affections. The opening sequence is just so good. Probably my favourite, well, along with Once Upon a Time in the West, my favourite opening sequence from the movie. It's a work of genius. It's so simple yet so profound. So you start at the end. Pat Garrett has become an old landowner now, an old ranch owner. And he's having some trouble with the new guard coming in. And they're secretly plotting to kill him. And a sniper gets ready to shoot him off his carriage. We cut back, all the way back to the beginning of Garrett going after Kid. And Billy the Kid is with his mates, and they're in this courtyard shooting. It's a turkey shoot. They're shooting at turkeys' heads. And what happens is the bullets start whizzing across the eras. So Billy the Kid raises his rifle, shoots. Garrett falls from his carriage. Decades later. Garrett might shoot back, and one of the turkeys' heads blows off. The connection of two different time zones purely through the shooting of guns, it's so brilliantly done. Even better, actually, in the late 80s director's cut, actually. It's just genius. And over the top of it is Bob Dylan's cruelly underrated score. Dylan's score is one of the great, great scores of all time. And it just, you listen to that music, and it captures the sort of low-level charm of male friendship, which is one of Peckinpah's great subjects and is explored brilliantly in this film. But there's building up undercurrents of danger and sadness. Unfortunately, the soundtrack album doesn't include the best piece of music from Dylan in the entire film, which comes in the next sequence. In the next sequence, Garrett now is going after Billy the Kid full time. And he's holding him up in this shack, and there's this big gun battle in this shack. And Billy the Kid is losing really badly. And Garrett, played by James Coburn, calls them off and says, come on out if you're still alive. And this is, I think, the best sequence in the film. Billy the Kid comes out and he spreads his arms like Jesus. And Coburn starts walking down the hill towards him with this massive, great big grin on his face. Those fantastic teeth James Coburn had. And they're looking at each other like two lovers, meeting after a long time. And while Coburn is walking down the hill, you have this fantastic soundtrack from Bob Dylan where he's going la 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 la, and it's this kind of wonderful, almost wedding-like chant, the reunion of these two lovers. It's fantastic, but it's not on the soundtrack album. And I love the way that Coburn just goes, it's me, like this. And then you get a dialogue exchange. The dialogue was written by Rudy Wurlitzer, which sums up everything the film is about in 3 short sentences. Chris Christopherson says, you're in poor company, Pat. And James Coburn says, yeah, but I'm alive though. And Chris Christopherson says, so am I. Everything in the film, that's what the film is about. Every single theme, every texture is there in those 3 simple lines of dialogue. And if you've watched that scene, watch Coburn's reaction to that last line from Chris Christopherson and the way he throws his cigar away. Brilliant piece of acting. Right? Then we come to that sublime scene with Slim Pickens, who's building, his dream is to build a boat to go down the river with his wife. And Coburn comes to recruit him, and they get involved in a shootout. And Pickens is mortally injured. And in his last moments, he crawls out to the river that he's dreamt of going down, holding his belly. And you hear that wonderful knock, knock, knocking on heaven's door by Bob Dylan, and his wife looking at him. It's an incredible sequence. And then the genius of Peckinpah is the follow-up scene, which doesn't get talked about very much. And it doesn't have anything to do with the plot. Pat Garrett is sitting under a tree on his own, and suddenly he sees down the river a makeshift raft, just like the one that Slim Pickens was going to make. There's shooting practice at a jar in the water. Playfully, Pat Garrett gets his rifle and starts to shoot them, but he frightens them, and they start shooting back at him. The unity of them, there's no unity. They're at odds with each other. This moment of shared enjoyment becomes a moment of enmity. That's the kind of poetry that marks out Peckinpah's films, that distinguishes them from the average Western and distinguishes them from so much American cinema. There's another scene I'd just like to talk about quickly. I love the scene where Pat Garrett corners two of Billy the Kid's associates in a bar, and he tells Bob Dylan plays this kind of weird character called Alias, right? And he tells Alias to go to the end of the bar and just read out the ingredients of the tins. So Bob Dylan's going, beans, onions, beans, like all the way through the scene. And then there's this kind of tense confrontation scene at the table between Pat Garrett and these two guys. That scene is one of the most brilliant, most oddball scenes in American film. I tell you now, this film moves me more and more as I get older. The power of what it's saying, the power of a man destroying his youth bit by bit, and the necessity of that, and the sadness of that necessity. And I think that makes it the most haunting and beautiful, and ultimately the most memorable of Peckinpah's films. Well, that's probably quite a long video. I'm sorry I blathered on about Peckinpah so much, but he's such an important filmmaker to talk about. Please let me know what you think below, and whether I should have put The Wild Bunch top. Perhaps I should have done. Anyway, thanks very much.